What is up, guys? I am the one and only Eagle Double T. And about 3 years ago, I did an unboxing video of the Scuf Prestige controller for the Xbox One. So today, we're going to be taking a look at how well it held up 3 years later. Let me start off by saying, even though I don't play Xbox that much anymore, I have still put a ton of hours into this controller. And I'm happy to report that it's held up quite well. So for the first part of this video, I'm going to get into the things that I like about this controller and how well it's held up. Starting off with the physical surfaces of this controller, I was a little bit nervous about getting a design like this for this controller because I knew this was going to be hydro dipped and I didn't know how well it was going to hold up, but I'm happy to report that it's held up great. It's pretty reliable and slick. It has a nice feel to it. And it really doesn't have any damage except for the couple of scratches right there, which I'm not sure how it happened. But overall, it hasn't worn down and it's been great. On the back, we have these very nice rubberized textured grips. You can see a little bit of wear around the corners here, which is to be expected for a controller that's been used quite heavily for 3 years. But overall, the pattern is still there, it's still grippy, and it still feels just like the day that I got it. Moving on to the buttons and physical interfaces of this controller, everything is held up great. The A, B, X, and Y buttons, the home button, these buttons in the middle, the D-pad, and the triggers and bumpers are all pretty much standard Xbox controller quality, which is fine. It's been quite reliable in my experience. The only thing that's different is you can choose what joysticks you get when you order this controller. So for me, this joystick right here is quite worn down. And I'll get to that in the later half of this video. This controller, this domed one, has held up great. There's almost no wear. It's been very grippy, and it's just been very great to use. Now, the two things I want to particularly focus on here is the massive improvements in the paddles and the way that the trigger locks work. Here we have the Scuf Infinity controller, which by this point is quite an old controller. Quickly after buying the Infinity, I developed massive problems with the paddles. They just quit working. They simply wore out. And that's another issue right there. Moving on to the buttons and the interface of this controller, it's held up great. The A, B, X, Y button, the D-pad, the middle buttons, the home button, and the bumpers are all pretty much standard Xbox controller quality from Microsoft, which is fine because generally I don't think people really have problems with any of those things, and they've held up great. Now, two things to note is when you buy this controller, you can choose what kind of joysticks you get. So for this joystick on the right, I chose a domed joystick that is a Scuf branded joystick. The rubber has held up great. It's very rubbery, it's worn great, and I'm just very happy with it. Now, this joystick up here, although I'm still quite happy with it, has worn significantly more than the right one. And this one was a dished joystick. And I'll get to this in the later half of this video. Now, I really want to focus on how much better the paddles and the trigger locks are on the Prestige controller as opposed to Scuf's previous Xbox controller, which was the Scuf Infinity, which I've had massive problems with in those two regards. Paddles on the Scuf Infinity are just not good. They're not really shaped for your finger. At the time when I got this controller, I thought they were fine, but holding it now, it's clear how much better they are on the Prestige. And after just a few short months, probably just 2 of me owning this controller, the paddles started to wear down. The physical buttons underneath the paddles started to wear down to the point where they no longer work. And you can hear a clear difference between the left one and the right one, because the right one was the one I used the most and it just wore down so quickly. But I'm very, very happy to report that that has not been an issue on the Prestige. They're a lot more comfortable. They have these little buttons here, almost like Braille, that just give it a nice texture. They're shaped more for your fingers and they're just a lot more comfortable, and I'm very happy to report that they do not have any wear issues like the Infinity did. Another big thing for me is the trigger locks. These trigger locks are simple. You just Here they're not engaged. The trigger goes all the way in, feels great. You can set the height and engage them. There we go. Now it's going in less. So it's very easy to switch between modes if I was to go from, let's say, Call of Duty, where I would want them engaged, to a game like Rocket League, where I would want to use the full extent of the trigger. So it's very seamless and it just works great. Now, even though there are a lot of great praises to be sung about this controller, there are 4 disadvantages in particular that I've experienced that I want to highlight now. So the first one is going to be battery life. Now this controller is rated for roughly 30 hours on a single charge. Now for contrast, a normal Xbox One controller is rated for about 30 hours with the rechargeable battery pack, and about like 30 to 40 with just standard AA batteries, depending on the quality of the battery. Now, from my experience, this controller has never been able to reach 30 hours, or really probably anywhere close. It says in the manual that if you do use the trigger locks, the impulse triggers, that will decrease the battery life. However, if that's the case, then it has decreased by a very significant amount. And to be honest, even when I don't use the trigger locks, I still think that it goes down quite quickly, at least more quickly than a normal Xbox controller. Now, the battery life isn't completely egregious. It's not terrible. However, it is a bit annoying because it definitely is noticeably lower than a regular Xbox controller. The second thing I want to discuss is the random paddle mapping reset that I've experienced. Now, for those of you who don't know, the way that you would program one of the face buttons to one of the paddles is by using this little magnetic tool that comes with the controller. You put it right here. You press down the paddle that you want to be mapped, and then you press the button, and then boom. So if I wanted to use the A button, then the A button would then be mapped to this paddle. And normally this system works great and it's very easy and I like it. However, there's been quite a handful of times where I'll go to play a game, I'll load into a match, I'll press the paddle. Normally I have the right one right here mapped to A, and it'll be mapped to something else. Now the main time I've experienced this is when this A paddle will just sporadically get mapped to the B button instead. I don't know why this happens. It doesn't happen frequently. However, it's happened enough to where I want to mention it because when I load into a game like Call of Duty and I'm expecting to use the A button with this paddle and all of a sudden it's the B button, that just really throws me off. And I'm not sure why this happens. It's not a huge deal, but I think it is worth mentioning. Now, the third issue, and the thing that has been by far the most annoying, is that even when this controller is charged, the controller will sometimes randomly shut off. I don't know why this happens. I don't know if somehow the low battery life and the controller shutting off are related issues, but it's sort of always done this. A lot of the times when I'm gaming and I'm holding the controller, normally it will stay on, and it normally doesn't shut off, but it does sometimes. However, it really especially rears its ugly head whenever I set the controller down. If I'm watching, let's say, like a YouTube video or a movie or something, or Hulu, I'll set the controller next to me, and virtually the second this controller touches the carpet, it will shut off. I'm not sure why it does this. It has been extremely annoying, and it's been a real issue that I've had. Like I said, it happens in-game sometimes, but it really happens when I'm trying to watch movies or use certain apps, and it is a pretty big inconvenience. I looked this issue up, and I can't seem to find anyone else with a similar issue, so I'm willing to chalk it up to it just being my specific controller, but I definitely wanted to talk about that. Now, the fourth and final issue is one that should be a big deal, but it's not to me, and I'll explain why. It's that earlier in the video, I referenced this joystick. Now, this joystick, as you can see, has very clearly eaten through the rubber. My thumb is eaten through the rubber right here. Now, the reason why this doesn't upset me tremendously is because the rubber that they use is extremely grippy. For up until recently, up until it really broke through and got significantly worse, even though it is consistently worn down, it has still given me such an advantage in game, just having such a grippy joystick that I can live with this, especially because I can get replacements for this fairly cheap. Now, the way to change these joysticks is quite easy, especially compared to the Infinity, which is just you take this front plate off. Here you have the joystick. There it is. Here's a good look at the wear. Now, I should note, this does come with two spare Xbox style joysticks, I think free of charge. These just came with the controller. And these are, when you choose the joystick you want, you don't have to get these ones. These are the Scuf branded joysticks. And I got these because I wanted to try them. And even though it has worn down, I think that they have just been so good to me in game in terms of the grip advantage that I have, that I can really live with the lower durability for the higher performance. Overall, I've been very happy with this controller, and it has been great to me. I don't know if the turning off issue that I mentioned is exclusive to this controller, because like I said, I can't find anything about that on Reddit or online. I'm willing to just chop it up to my controller has some sort of weird defect and that isn't normal. But regardless, it is a massive improvement over the Infinity controller, which, like I mentioned, pretty much self-destructed in my hand over just a few month period. If I had to give this controller a rating, I would give it probably a 8 out of 10. It's been just overall, like I said, great to me. If you're serious about getting a high performance Xbox One controller, I definitely would go with this controller, especially over the Xbox Elite controller, which I personally am just not a huge fan of. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe and comment down below what you think of the Scuf Prestige controller. I am the one and only Eagle Double T signing off. Goodbye.